Well, thanks, Kevin. And thanks to the team for putting this briefing together, and thank you all of you for turning up. It's this is one of the first briefings of the new consultation that's just been kicked off on the spatial options for the core strategy update. Really important. This is big handful stuff, but it will set the scene for the policy development, improvement and tweaking that goes on subsequently, and really key that we look at all the alternatives and make some good decisions now about what that top level policy wireframe looks like. So thank you all. Please do promote this consultation in your wards and with your parishes and any neighbourhood development plan groups that have existed or are running at the moment. This is all really good, important stuff, and it's one of the key ways in which members of the public, parishes, businesses, interested groups can have an influence on the planning policy framework for the authority. It doesn't happen often at this level, and it's really important that we seize the opportunities when they arise. So thank you very much, and over to Flo to set the scene for the workshop today.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Our event today provides the first opportunity for you as members to engage in this whole local plan process. But before we start, I just want to caveat everything that we're going to say today with the proviso that we're expecting news on the Levelling Up Bill today, and that could change a lot of things. So let's wait and see what happens there. But we need to start doing what we're doing at the moment. And this is the initial stage in our local plan consultation. We're looking at a series of high-level spatial options, and we began the public consultation on the 17th of January. So today's workshop is a chance to find out more about our spatial options and provide some initial feedback regarding the advantages and disadvantages of each of these published options. Our session today is going to begin with a 20-minute presentation setting out a summary of the paper delivered by Dan and by Siobhan. We want you to use the chat facility for questions, and if we're not able to get back with a response this morning, we will respond to you later. But I also want to say there is absolutely nothing that you can't ask. There are no stupid questions, there are no daft questions. You need to ask everything that you want to ask here with us today. Following the presentation, the members are going to be divided into groups to firstly consider the aspects of the county-wide options before we'll ask you to report back on that discussion. There'll then be a second workshop to consider the implications of the spatial options for the rural parts of the county, followed again by a reporting session. And each of these workshop groups will have a facilitator and other officers to help with the discussion. And the event will end with the details of the next step in the plan making process. And we are recording this session. It will be available via the council website. So I want to encourage you to really get engaged, quiz the officers, and let's see where we get to at the end of each of our discussions. So I'm now going to hand you over to Dan and to Siobhan, who are going to present the paper.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, just going to start the presentation. Emily, can you put the slides up? You've got a second. Okay, so yep. Good morning to everybody. So as we outlined, I'll be going through the section in regards to sort of spatial options consultation. That'll be the first part of the presentation. So as part of this spatial options consultation, we have outlined 5 broad options for the pattern and scale of new housing development for Herefordshire in the 2021 to 2041 plan period. So this consultation is focused on how to accommodate housing across Herefordshire. Other important issues such as employment, land and provision of infrastructure and services will be addressed at a later stage. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so The overall housing requirement has been taken from the government standard method, which determines how many dwellings need to be delivered every year. The standard method indicates 850 dwellings per year for Herefordshire, or 17,000 dwellings over the next 20 years of the plan period. The spatial option has also taken into account the existing 5,800 planning permissions. So therefore, we're currently looking at accommodating approximately 11,000 dwellings to allocate. Further information on the county's housing need can be found in Herefordshire's Housing Market and Needs Assessment, which was published last year in July 2021. So as well as housing requirements, other issues also have to be considered. The local plan will be closely integrated to the Hereford Transport Strategy Review, and the local transport plan will be updated within the next 18 months. Further work will be required to review the impact of transport in regards to the options within this consultation. This consultation is also based on the understanding that the current restrictions of development in the Lug catchment will be resolved at an early stage of the updated plan period. These options show the way that development could be distributed, and each option takes different approaches over to this, which I'll show you shortly. Each option displays a map that includes rounded up figures for Hereford, the market towns, and the rural areas. The map also shows the scale of development under each option at a low, medium, or high level growth. And this is proportionate in the sense of what is a high level growth for Kington, for example, maybe a low growth for Hereford, depending on the size of the locations. So we'll now be going for this into more detail. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first option, so this is the housing need baseline option. So this option is based completely on the market demands identified in the recently published 2021 Housing Market Needs Assessment. The purpose of the study is to provide robust evidence of the levels of housing needs across Herefordshire's 7 housing market areas. So this would, broadly speaking, represent a continuation of the strategy similar to the existing core strategy, resulting in sustained development in the larger market towns, Hereford and the rural areas, respectively. With regards to the market towns, their role as thriving service centres will continue to be emphasised. Bromyard and Kingston will experience more moderate development due to their smaller size. Ledbury is also identified for limited growth, though it has already met its housing targets with existing permissions. It will need to be ensured that the market towns can accommodate the proposed level of growth within their environmental constraints, whilst maintaining their distinctiveness. In Hereford, a transport assessment will be required to determine whether it can continue to accommodate the level of growth proposed in light of the changes to the transport strategy for the city. The highest proportion of identified need is in the rural areas, compared with Hereford City and the market towns, as can be seen in the table on the slide there. Trends in housing delivery in the rural areas have been strong, so similar levels of development to those currently would likely continue to be experienced here. It's still important to note the various options for distribution of the rural portion of the growth will be set out in the second session, which Siobhan will go through shortly. The rural share of development will need a broader distribution of growth, and with a more localised focus on meeting housing need, and could have a role in delivering rural affordable housing. However, spreading development more thinly in this way could result in limited individual benefits, such as the delivery of key infrastructure and facilities that could be sourced from larger developments. It could also lead to a county-wide issue increase in traffic levels. Then we can go to the next option, please. So this is option 2, focus on market towns and rural-based growth. This option would disperse growth across the county's 5 market towns and rural areas, while significantly lowering the housing requirements in Hereford City. This could afford more flexibility as the city's transport strategy evolves, following the determination not to pursue the South Y and Hereford transport packages in the existing core strategy. This option could potentially increase more affordable housing and infrastructure in both the market towns and rural areas, helping address imbalances between Hereford City and these areas in this regard. The distribution proportion to each market town will be determined by constraints, site availability and suitability at these locations. As mentioned in the last option, the distribution for the rural portion will be determined separately, the option of which will be set out later. As regards to Hereford, this was significantly less than the requirement identified in the housing market needs assessment and could weaken the city's ability to attain affordable housing and infrastructure. Though conversely, it could reduce pressure on the city's existing infrastructure and services. It could also reduce the reliance on large urban extensions like those in the existing strategy, for which delivery trends have not been reliable. But also taking account Hereford's environmental constraints, such as the areas prone to flooding and phosphate levels in the River Wye. And the next option, please, option number 3. So this is option 3, focus growth across market towns and Hereford. This distribution option would focus greater growth across the county's market towns and Hereford. The results would be a significant uplift in growth levels for the market towns, with a smaller one for Hereford, and a significant decrease in the rural areas when compared with option 1. This would direct development to areas that can support and exist services, infrastructure and businesses, albeit with some of those likely requiring expansion. So broadly speaking, it's consistent with the settlement hierarchy for the county as a whole and would support the overall principle of sustainable development. Conversely, this option could lead to stagnation of the age structure in the county's rural villages, with a reduction in housing stock that would help to retain the younger population. Restraining development in these areas could also mean that some villages may struggle to retain services. As with option 1, distribution will need to ensure that the market towns could accommodate this uplift in growth within their environmental constraints and without losing their local distinctiveness. By placing emphasis on larger urban expansion sites, there could be potential to attain high levels of affordable housing and deliver more planned, sustainable, better connected patterns of development. But historic low levels of delivery must also be noted here. And can we go to option 4, please? So this is the single market growth town option. So this option would see one of the county's larger market towns, namely Ledbury, Ross or Leinster, made a focus for growth. The result of this would be one of these 3 towns having an approximate growth target of 2,000 new dwellings. So in this option, Hereford City would have a growth target of 4,000 and rural areas having a significantly reduced growth target compared to the existing core strategy, totaling around 3,300. So the 3 candidate towns that have been chosen for this option was based on their existing role as service centres and potential capacity to accommodate such level of growth. Determining which of these would be best placed to take the growth would be subject to more detailed assessment of land availability and suitability in each of the towns. You may note that Bromyard and Kington have not been included as candidates. This is because their constraints to development, smaller capacity for development, and also smaller services and infrastructure owing to their sizes. And can we go to option 5, please? So this is the option 5, new rural settlement with a growth focused in Leinster and Bromyard. This option proposes one or more new settlements located in a rural area of the county. This could deliver over a third of the rural housing growth target if it's carried forward. Should a 1,500 dwelling new settlement be delivered, Leinster and Bromyard would see a proportionate large-scale growth with moderate targets in Hereford and Ross. The remainder of these targets would be distributed across existing rural settlements. The new settlement question will need to be in a location that is well connected physically, economically and socially with existing settlements. Whilst there will need to be service provision that allows for some degree of self-sufficiency, The settlement should not be too isolated. Neither it must have a detrimental effect on the viability or vitality of existing centres by diverting economic activity away from them. The settlement should be accessible by sustainable modes of transport, either located on a rail route or somewhere that can be easily served by bus services. We carry this option forward, and for it to deliver on the objectives of it, there will be a number of requirements. Firstly, the settlement would need to be an appropriate size that can support new services that a new community would create a requirement for. Taking a baseline figure, a 1,500 dwelling settlement could support a new primary school and a local centre. Therefore, a large assembly of appropriate land for development would need to be made available, and in an area not cause damage to the local ecology, landscape, historic value, or future climate resilience. If possible, use should be made of brownfield land, though it is acknowledged this will be challenging in the rural areas. It also should be made clear this will be a lengthy process. Delivering new settlements require comprehensive master planning and long lead-in times. Therefore, delivery will be likely towards the latter end of the plan period. A 1,500 dwelling settlement will likely average 150 dwellings per annum. So this is the last of the 5 options at the end of this part of the presentation. And now Siobhan's going to discuss the rural options in more detail. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Dan, for that presentation. And I will take you through the rural area spatial option now. As you saw in Dan's slides, there were varying levels of growth for each strategic option, as shown on the pie charts and overall figures in the tables. This varied across the board for the city, towns, and rural areas. So the outcome for the rural options will be influenced by the strategic option choices. Similarly, what you might like to see in the rural option may help to determine what your preferred strategic option is. These 2 sets of options are interdependent. So just moving on to the next slide, where we'll talk a little bit more about the process. At this stage, it is undecided what the amount of growth rural areas will need to accommodate, but we expect they could accommodate up to 6,500 dwellings. And it could be less than this, depending on what the strategic option we proceed with will be. The process chart on the slide shows how the evidence base will feed and inform rural strategy and policies right up to adoption of the local plan. The parish questionnaire, which was sent out before Christmas, has just finished consultation, and we will be looking at all the responses received. Work is underway on the rural areas background paper and settlement hierarchy. This is our evidence base to inform the strategy for development here. This review looks at current services, infrastructure, environmental constraints, and accessibility to help determine a list of settlements that would be able to accommodate some growth. We anticipate consulting on this paper later this spring. This will mean we will be able to analyse the results going into the summer and further develop the rural areas policies ready for a draft plan. Just going on to the next slide. So here you have a summary of the different options for the rural areas. There will be more detail on each after this slide, but just a quick overview tells you that option 1 is a dispersed approach, and it reflects the current strategy of dispersed housing growth in settlements. You can see from the pie chart that there are many pieces in this one, and each piece represents a settlement. So lots of settlements would be identified on this option. Option 2 is the housing growth in larger settlements. The larger settlements would see more growth than the dispersal strategy. Larger proportionate growth would be accommodated in each of the identified settlements. So there are slightly less pieces in this pie chart. Going into option 3, which would see housing growth in the rural hubs. This would be further reducing the list of settlements where growth can happen. This will mean more significant growth in each settlement. And then slightly different to all the other options is the housing growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas through option 4. This would mean focusing development in settlements outside these designated areas with much less within these areas. So moving on to the next slide, I'll just take you through option 1, which is the dispersal approach. This option is similar to the current rural distribution in the core strategy. This is a dispersed approach across a greater number of settlements. This means less growth in a larger amount of settlements, but settlements will be selected following our results on the settlement hierarchy and background evidence review. Possible outcomes for this option would be retention of existing services in settlements and continuation of proportionate growth with a focus on key services, a good level of accessibility, and taking into account environmental impacts. The downside is it provides minimal opportunities for affordable housing in villages, as small sites will not deliver this. It is more difficult sustainability-wise, as dispersed growth can make it harder for sustainable active travel. Just moving on to option 2, which is development in larger settlements. Now, the purpose of this option is to focus on fewer settlements than in option 1. So be moving away from the current strategy of wide dispersal to a more limiting strategy across a reduced number of rural settlements. The rural option would see a higher proportion of growth in and around an identified number of settlements considered suitable for growth. These settlements are likely to have a reasonable level of accessibility, services, and facilities with adequate transport links. It should provide a better range of housing to meet wider needs, including the aging population, but this will require further detail. It could help to facilitate investment in infrastructure, such as schools, health facilities, and open space. Provision of sustainable travel is more likely to be achieved, and it could help to sustain current village services. Just going on to option 3, which is the rural hubs. Under this option, all rural growth is focused at a small number of key settlements. Of all the options, this one would have the least amount of settlements identified. This would result in more dwellings at each hub location. It is anticipated that those identified would have good levels of public transport links with a wider availability of services and less environmental constraints. Concentration of growth in the hubs would mean other settlements would have a reduced level of growth and could be more limiting. The impact of these levels of growth on a settlement could be relatively significant. This will be subject to further work, including with the parish councils, to derive the most appropriate approach and assess the suitability of potential sites through our housing land assessment, which is currently underway. This option would require large-scale greenfield development on the edge of settlements because there is a limited brownfield supply. There will be greater environmental issues to take into account due to more development being concentrated in fewer places to meet the rural growth target. Opportunities for placemaking, however, are increased to incorporate additional facilities such as open space, green infrastructure, and community facilities, for example. There is much to consider with schools and how they will be affected by increased populations too. So that will all need further research. So the fourth option, which is our growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas. Now, this option reflects the proposals set out in the Planning White Paper 2020, where those areas were identified as needing more protection. So therefore, the potential for development and growth inside these areas could be quite limited. So for context, overall, there are 40 conservation areas in rural Herefordshire and 2 AONBs. Outcomes for this option will mean larger settlements outside AONBs and conservation areas may receive a greater proportion of growth. It will help to sustain such villages as service centres, create affordable housing and sustainable travel. On the plus side, there will be limited growth in these designated areas, and that will have likely benefits that assist in protecting the natural and built environment. However, some of these will be larger settlements that contain many key services and are reasonably accessible, and restricting growth here may have negative effects in such areas. What we do not know is if central government will continue with this approach through planning guidance and legislation. That remains to be seen. So you can see that starting with option 1, to option 3, the list of settlements will get smaller, but the level of growth per settlements would increase, and the implications vary across all the options. So to finish up, we'd like to know if you have any questions on either the strategic spatial options or any queries about the rural options. Thank you for listening. I can see a hand raised.
Councillor Gandhi.
Yeah, I can't see anybody.
Take this. Can we take the presentation down, please? That's better. Thank you.
Yeah, I noticed that you've talked about a separate larger settlement of about 1,500 houses somewhere. But I did wonder, I mean, bearing in mind that going forward, you know, this county, particularly in the rural areas, is not going to be able to continue through the generations to build houses for the children of the children of the children of the children. And so at some stage that will not be possible. Whether you've considered looking at the total housing requirement and actually looking for a site which you could provide a new market town, which could be a trailblazer in as much as being an eco-friendly market town with all the transport links, with housing which is built to a standard which is not present available in Herefordshire, and with cycle routes, etc., etc. So you've basically put forward a model of what could come in the future with market towns, rather than trying to put it into lots of different areas, some of which will take it, but will just make them a lot more crowded and they don't have the infrastructure. Or you will find that some parts of the county just don't have the land at all to take them. And a large market town would offer you the opportunity for a significant amount of affordable housing, along with schools and other things.
Thank you, Councillor Gandhi. What we have with the new settlement is, I suppose, something we've never done before in this county. So trying to identify a site even for an area even for 1,500 dwellings is quite ambitious to start off with. And on balance with that, we have to provide a level of housing across this planned period. So that, in effect, is taking some of the growth away from the overall 17,000. And albeit there is nothing to stop that new settlement growing into the future. So beyond the planned period, it could increase in size if that is what the ambition is. But we are slightly tied in by our requirement to meet the housing need within this planned period going into 2041.
Yes, thanks, Ron. And also, I think what I mentioned in my presentation, sort of the lead-in times to do this is probably expecting this to be later in the plan period if we did go ahead with the new settlements.
So nobody's actually looked at whether there's anything, whether it's possible to actually consider a new market town somewhere, possibly in the south or the north, that's got access to the railway, etc., that could be considered. Because if we don't do it now, we're not going to do it. I mean, it's as simple as that, because things will just move on and the housing will get spread across. And I just feel it's an ideal opportunity to actually carry out the wishes of the administration, which is for people not to have to use their cars to get to work, and the fact that we don't have in any of our market towns the real facilities for cycle routes and walking and access to public transport in the way that we would want. And it just seems to me madness to not even consider that as an option and put it forward to see what the public thought of that as an option. I mean, I can only quote where I've come from. When we had to find 6,500 houses in a district, and we've just found a site for 2,500, and that's in a district, and this is a county, and I struggle with this a bit, really.
Thank you, Councillor Gandy. I suppose with the size of the settlement that we're proposing in that option for 1,500 dwellings, we have Kington, which isn't much bigger, with about 1,600 dwellings. So I suppose Herefordshire, by its nature, its sort of geography and the towns here we've got, things are smaller. But I take what you're saying, that we need to be thinking about the access to transport and rail, that needs to be considered, and that is something that we are looking into. We are exploring, the Pontrilas option, and any links that we could make into the Ledbury line as well. So that is definitely part and parcel of this work that we're doing.
Councillor Gandy, I think what you're talking about is actually a hybrid of what's actually in the plan. So it's just and this is what the consultation is all about. It's bringing out these additional ideas, and that sort of feeding out from the consultation. So if we go to Jenny, Councillor Hewitt.
So yeah, thank you, and it's great to see the TFG suggestion coming up, because I think it would, lots of us are rural councillors and have seen this sort of scattered proportions shoved into rural villages which have absolutely no amenities, and it has ridden roughshod over many NDPs and created an awful lot of upset. So I was a bit at odds with the identified level of housing need, and I'd like to see how you arrived at that, because you're saying that's where the identified housing need has arisen. I would suggest that it's more that there's been pressure to find allocated sites because they had to, and that's where it's come from. So the comment from my local resident, and he's pretty hot on these things about spatial planning, was saying that the way you calculate housing needs to be related to employment opportunities and schools and shops and local amenities. So, in terms of the spatial options which have been put forward, there are a couple of questions I'd like to. Well, I mean, I suppose the 6,500 is a guesstimate about what the rural areas will need to cover. But, I think it would be misleading. It seems to me, I don't know, this is my question. Is it misleading to say that the rural areas have the highest identified need? Because I would imagine that families wanting to send their children to schools or find employment don't necessarily want to jump in their cars or have to drive every week to get their shopping. Can you give some comment about that, please?
You want me to answer that, Kevin? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Please, Kevin. Yes.
I mean, the overall target, as was stated at the beginning, was really based on that standard method, which is given to us by the government, and that the MPPF says effectively is our objectively assessed need. And I realise that's basically a formula given to us by government to work that out. And then that additional bit of evidence base, which was the housing market and needs assessment, which was published last year, which looked at effectively the demographics of that without applying policy to it. So what we're suggesting here is a range of policies that could be applied to that to change that distribution. So yeah, you're right. If the preferred way forward is to reduce that rural requirement, then that is one of the options open to us as part of this work. Again, we're here trying to set out a number of discrete options. There are probably thousands and thousands of options that we could have put in this paper, but we need to have a manageable number of discrete options to try and get a response from the public and everything else. The final option will almost certainly be a hybrid of a number of these.
Okay, so the word needs actually doesn't really mean what it says, in common parlance.
The needs, that assessment, that if you like, that overall requirement and the way of calculating it is set out currently by national government. Yeah. As Flo said earlier, the original planning white paper suggested that target would be a mandatory target. It's not yet, but it's still set out in that standard method that is set out in national planning policy. How we distribute that is our within the council's gift, effectively. So we're looking at a range of options potentially to do that. You could the option one is just based on that demographic assessment, and it's called need, but you can argue
obligation, housing obligation,
yeah,
maybe a better.
Nevertheless, that's what how it's framed. Yeah. But that distribution is for us is for the council to decide ultimately.
Okay, so it's important for me because I have to go back to this resident and say, why are we being identified that there's a need there? And we're just saying it's a county need to provide housing, but we're not underpinning that with whether there are employment, transport, schooling opportunities. That's not what we're doing. We're doing that within our options that you just presented.
We're doing that within the options. Ultimately, yeah, if there is a capacity issue, when we've done all the evidence base and collected all that evidence base, if there is a strong case to go back to government and say we cannot accommodate that level for these really, and we would have to be really substantial and robust reasons, then we would potentially be able to argue that target is not deliverable within Herefordshire. There are other things we would then need to do, like talking to neighbouring authorities and so on, to see whether they could take that growth. But I think we need to start with, our starting point needs to be, we're going to meet the needs as set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. So that's why we started with this, if you like, this position.
Yes, and following on from Kev, as part of our evidence base, we will be commissioning a piece of work. So we will be commissioning a piece of work on employment land review shortly, and obviously that will sort of go to further detail about employment land and perhaps areas where it could be allocated in the county.
Councillor Owen.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I think Jenny put it in the chat roll about excluding AONBs, and that might be something that would help concentrate the mind if we just shade those areas in so that we know that there's going to be minimal in those areas. But a lot of employment, over the last 2 years, we've found out that an awful lot of employment is either, especially out in the sticks, is either the service industries, when you actually do need to physically travel to get around to, whether it's plumbing or electrics or anything like that. And don't forget care work as well. You do need to have transport for that. Or there's always the work from home option, which we're all going to see is become bigger and bigger and bigger. But my question really is, what are our natural growth numbers at present for things like single applications or really small developments like infill or agricultural conversions, the building of annexes to house a senior member of the family, or something that's going to happen an awful lot, conversion to residential from commercial? Don't know how many do we normally churn out anyway yearly, because the final figure, we think 14,000 houses, blimey. But if we're already doing 300, 400, 600 a year, then that figure is obviously going to be nowhere near as with the intention of this is what we've got to find. I don't know who's best placed to answer that one.
I suppose it's me partly. All I can identify there, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but what I can say is the team process in the region of 4,000 applications a year. And the majority of those applications are smaller applications for extensions, up to 1 to 10 dwellings, etc., annexes, etc. So there's a significant amount of applications which run through the system now and have been over a number of years. And you know, over 4,000 applications this year, and we've consistently hit around about 4,000 over the last 4 or 5 years. So those applications are still running through the system.
So are we looking at a naturally reaching this target, or halfway towards naturally reaching this target anyway?
Well, those sort of applications follow on generally from a lot of them for the smaller dwellings, from the smaller developments, from the neighbourhood plans, who identify areas where development can go within those villages, infill plots, etc. They are often identified within they are then policy compliant. So those come through, and that always happens with when you are plan making. That always happens. When you get towards the end of a consultation, you're bringing out that new plan, whether it's a neighbourhood plan or whether it's like this will be the core strategy. You will get an influx of applications coming through because people will see certainty as regards where that their application is going to be policy compliant moving forward. So that always happens. You will always get that influx of applications coming through. I've seen it time and time again. Councillor Simons.
Yes, thank you. I think the thing for me is it's about ambition and control. At the moment, the current arrangement, and indeed any of the models that have kind of dispersed development through the market towns, rural areas, wherever, we are heavily dependent on the desires and priorities of developers who will sit on land banks. By and large, you know, there's a lot of frustration with Section 106 perhaps not delivering the infrastructure we want when we want it. And it feels as though we are, you know, by and large, once we've set the framework, we are then at the mercy of third parties as to when any of this happens. So for me, I think that's the strongest argument to look at a new settlement, you know, whether that's Pontrialus, and, you know, without setting hairs running, you know, Wellington looks well located in terms of transport infrastructure. There might be other reasons why not to, and, you know, don't kill me for that if it's wrong, but there appear to be some potential sites where we could set an ambition and say, right, forget 1,500, we're going to have a 2,000, 2,500 dwelling settlement. We're going to have employment as part of that. If it's not already there, we're going to build a transport infrastructure. We're going to have it connected with cycle networks into Hereford and wherever else people need to go. And it's us driving the programme. And that, for me, is the single biggest reason why that should be the centre of our spatial planning ambition. You know, the opportunity sites and infill stuff in the neighbourhood plans will mean there is still some small development piecemeal here and there in the villages and so forth. But actually, you know, that can bubble along at the pace that anybody else wants to set, because there's probably not much 106 or infrastructure linked to it. Whereas we focus our efforts on having a flagship development that's sustainable, it's low carbon, it's high employment, and it's a model settlement. You know, why is Prince Charles the only person designing model settlements these days? It just feels to me like a huge opportunity, and we'd be, I don't know, it's a bit emotive, but kind of betraying our residents if we weren't prepared to stand up and be counted and say, right, that's the ambition. That's all I have to say.
And I think that's right, and that's what will come. That I think you're all talking about a hybrid of what's, and that's what the consultation is all about. Is bringing out these ideas. We are starting to run over a bit. We've got 2 more people wanting raise questions. Can I ask them just very quickly, and then I will go to Kevin, who will outline the workshops as Sam will start to put you in there. So, Councillor Polly Andrews.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Well, there are substantial developments already in Hereford. New town, there's what appears to be almost a new town off the Roman road with, again, limited facilities. And I would also suggest that if you put substantial developments in the smaller market towns, what about employment opportunities? Otherwise, people will simply be commuting.
And that will come forward as part, as Dan has said, as part of the employment study, which will be commissioned, which has been commissioned.
Yes, but it's all right commissioning, but getting people to put employment there.
Yes, indeed. Councillor Wilding.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to go back to that thing you were saying about housing needs, and the formulas have been given to us by government to work out the housing needs. I don't think take account of the needs of the countryside and in terms of the climate and environmental emergency. I don't think anything I've heard so far, apart from the idea that we have some kind of settlement that is truly sustainable, addresses that massive thing that's just hanging over us about the environmental, ecological disaster we're facing. We're sitting here going on about how we're going to get loads of houses by 2040 or whatever, but you know, who knows what the world's going to be like by then if we just carry on the way we are. So I'd like to see a lot more of our own ambitions to make really truly sustainable things. And I don't understand why we have to why is there no option 6 to go back to government and say we don't want these many houses in Herefordshire? Why can't we be making a case that Herefordshire should be a special case? It's like the lungs of the county, of the country rather, and it shouldn't be built all over. So I'd like to see more options. I just think it's, anyway, yeah, I'll ramble on if I don't stop now.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Kevin, would you like to, a quick response before moving us into the workshops?
The only thing I'd say is what we've said earlier, really. The requirement is that the county should aim to meet its growth levels as set out by government. If through this process there's clear evidence that we can't do that, then that's the point that we go back to government to say that. I think we can't. What we don't want, because I don't think it would stand up at examination, is to start on go right from the starting point to say we're not going to deliver that formula that the government have given us for assessing housing need. I think we need to prepare the evidence, if that's the case, to go back to government, but that shouldn't be our starting point, would be my advice.
Okay for that, but I just think it should be included. It shouldn't just be up to me to have a bit of a moan and then for us to say, oh yeah, that's is not there. It should be there. It should be an option, I believe, anyway, because Herefordshire's natural capital is very precious and is constantly under attack, and we need to be protecting it more. Thanks.
Thank you. So Kevin, would you like to take us through into the workshops then?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean the workshop, not sure the time. We might have to just reduce the time a bit on the workshops, but we've got 2 workshops. The first one, which we'll go into now, is really about the sort of debate that we've already been having to an extent. There are 3 questions about which may be the most sustainable of the options that we've decided. One about the urban areas and one about the new settlements. So I think we're going to divide you into 3 groups. I think is probably right. We've got a facilitator in each group to just run through those. And again, I think it'll probably be largely a continuation of the debate that we've just been having, but hopefully we'll come back later with someone reporting from each group. We'll capture that information as well. And again, we'll try and get back to as many of the questions as we can later. Okay, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin.